Buon pomeriggio. Mi scuserete se dopo qualche parola in italiano poi mi sposto all'inglese, ma è un modo perché siccome ci sono davvero tante cose da dire, riusciamo ad andare più veloci ed affrontarle una per una. Tra l'altro, questa mattina abbiamo fatto una scoperta interessante, cioè che il libro, l'ultimo libro di Rajan, in inglese è di 500 pagine e in italiano è di 600 pagine, quindi forse se passiamo alla lingua inglese riusciamo ad andare un po' più veloce su alcuni degli aspetti che dobbiamo affrontare. Sono davvero tantissime le cose che sono emerse in questi giorni in più di 200 incontri che si sono tenuti qui al festival. So I switch to English then. In 3.5 days of discussion, having involved, no doubt, some of the brightest and the greatest mind of the world on issues like globalization, political representation, and nationalism, we learn a number of things. I think we got certainly a better understanding of the causes of the revolution in political representation that we experience worldwide, not only in Latin America as in past experience, but also in advanced democracy. We understood why there has been this revival of nationalism. Perhaps we have been a bit less successful in finding remedies to the darkest sides of this development. We know that the policies that some of the government that are led by populists are taking are wrong. But it would not be honest to say that we know exactly which are the right response to the disease, to the difficult situation where many people are, and that are the basis of the success of these nationalist policies. And I think, no doubt, it was a merit of the populist movements worldwide to repoliticize some of the issues, to have force public debate on issues like migration, like trade protection, and so on and so forth. So in medical terms, if you want to move to a medical analogy, I would say that we have at this stage a good diagnosis. We have some elements of a prognosis, but we are very far from finding the right therapy. In terms of the diagnosis, I think we identify some of the determinants of this change that is taking place. And these have to be found in a mixture of economic shocks, or major economic shocks, technological change, the issue that was addressed in the previous edition of the festival, also globalization, but perhaps technological change is more important than globalization, the Great Recession, that we know how deep it was, and also the refugee crisis. So all of this certainly have played an important role, but there are also cultural factors, like a backlash, the cultural backlash, the fact that ideological anchors of the past are no longer there. So we want to take advantage of the presence at this festival of Raghuram Rajan, who just wrote a wonderful and enlightening book, The Third Pillar, to try and draw some indications as to how to proceed. Raghu has been one of the first, has been at one of the first edition of the festival some 10 years ago. Meanwhile, between his first visit and this second visit, he has been for 3 years the chief economist and director for research at the International Monetary Fund. He has been for another 3 years governor of the Reserve Bank of India. He has written very influential books. I believe that this is going to be another one of his very influential books, but let me remember also Fault Lines and What I Do. He has also been president of the American Finance Association, was awarded the Infosys Prize for Economic Science, the Deutsche Bank Prize for Financial Economics, the Euromoney Central Bank Governor of the Year 2014, and the Banker Group, which is part of the Financial Times Group, Central Bank Governor of the Year 2016 award. So I just wonder what else he can do before next visit. I'm sure we will do whatever we can to make sure that the next spell, non-in-trained of his life, will be shorter than this one, but I'm sure that next time he will be here, there will be many other things to say about his biography. So let me start with the first question that is very important and is addressed in his book and complements very well the things that were said at the beginning of the festival. In particular, Cas Mudde, a political scientist, provided a very good definition of populism as something is a thin ideology that views the conflict as having on the one end the people conceived as a monolith, and on the other end an elite which is also conceived as a monolith and which is corrupt. Also, James Robinson, in his opening lecture, and then Daron Acemoglu, have been describing in a very effective way this very tiny corridor of democracy and liberty and freedom, and the fact that if you find the right balance between these two forces, otherwise you derail and you end up in dictatorships. But your book suggests that there is something else, which is very important. There are many things in the middle, and there are people there in the middle. There are communities of people, civil society associations, non-governmental organizations that play a very important role in our societies. And they can be also the best antidotes against demagogy and shortcuts and possibly derailments of our democracies. The problem is, however, as you rightly pointed out in your book, that technological shocks and trade liberalization, but again, perhaps as a minor factor, the most important is technological change, have severely hampered the action of these communities. As you write down, the ICT revolution has somewhat destroyed some communities, and we now have for the most dysfunctional communities. The European election that we're analyzing the debate in the forum also the first day have suggested that there is a clear divide in the vote between the urban conurbation and everything which is outside, local communities, small communities, small towns, villages, and municipalities, where often the permanent losers of this technological change are concentrated. So the obvious question is then, what should we do to restore these communities? What should we do to make them more inclusive? Should we provide federal transfer, federal contribution, but then, I mean, if they are dysfunctional, are they capable of absorbing these funds and using them the best way they should do? Should we expand infrastructure, both digital as well as road infrastructure, to make them somewhat more involved in the globalization? Should we support a local revival project, as was that you describe in your book? There is a wonderful description of what happened in a quarter in Chicago. You know, this Raul Raimundo, if I remember correctly his name, who leading an NGO completely changed the shape, the profile of a quarter of Chicago. And so, I mean, what can we do, basically?
It's a great question. Let me start first by actually offering a small correction for those who plan to read the book. It's only 500 pages in Italian, 400 in English. So the inflation rate is a little higher from English to Italian.
Okay.
But it's
20%.
20. The reality is today we understand much better than we did a few years ago the causes of the problem. Solutions are much more difficult. But I think what we've seen in the 10 years after the financial crisis, and maybe the last 30 years when we've experienced the technological revolution that Professor Boeri was talking about, that it's not a problem of cycle. It's not about more fiscal or monetary stimulus, which is what governments have resorted to time and again, and sometimes in addition to all that, easy credit, which was the subject of my previous book. It's really about the fact that in developed countries, there are large pockets of underdevelopment, where entire areas are no longer able to keep up with the global economy and are falling further and further behind. And they're falling behind not just economically, that's the first thing that happens, but as they lose jobs, their social structure also starts breaking down. This is certainly the experience in the United States, where first the jobs go, then after the jobs go, you start seeing family breakdown, more divorces, more teenage pregnancies, and more substance abuse. And as the community starts breaking down, community institutions start also going south. That is, the schools deteriorate, the best families leave the community, leaving a much weaker sort of social infrastructure behind. So I think when you ask the question, the first is to recognize the policies that don't work. The policies that don't work are first stimulus policies, because this is not about stimulus, this is about growth. If you went to a developing country and say, the way I get you to develop is to put more stimulus in the economy, people would start laughing, because ultimately development is a different problem. The second, I think, to focus on is that this is development from the center is very hard, because each of the communities has its own problems. And that's why I pointed to this community in Chicago, the Pilsen community, where the main problem is crime. If you don't solve crime, no amount of fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus is going to get anybody to open a business in that area, because crime is so strong that it keeps everybody else out. So they had to first solve the problem of crime, which had to be solved internally. How do you stop the places where crime is really strong in the area? And they figured out the first way to do it was to close down the bars where a lot of the criminals congregated. So they asked the city to remove the license. That was the first step. There are many others that I talk about in the book, but the point is that much of the action has to shift from centralized to what economists call place-based. That is, they have to target specific places. But it has to be not centralized place-based. That can be supportive, but ultimately the action has to come from internally. That's, if you look at the history of development across countries, that's how countries have developed. Not because a whole lot of foreign aid has come in, but because the countries decide they have to move forward. Now, to some extent, this makes the problem very difficult, because there is no button you can press sitting in Rome or sitting in Washington to make the changes in a local community. It is often action that the community itself sort of takes up. But what I wanted to emphasize with that example of Pilsen is even the poorest downtrodden communities can do it, provided they can find the will. And that's really the difficult part. How do you find the will? How do you find the leadership? How do you find the community engagement to start on this process? The outside can help. The outside can help in building infrastructure. The outside can help in providing funding. But the will has to come from inside.
And the thing is made even more complicated by the fact that sometimes the best people from these communities leave. One of the implications of globalization is that they migrate, they go elsewhere.
Which is where some of the ability for the center to act may come from. How do you provide incentives for the best people in a community to stay, for them not to take their children and leave because they fear for the future of their children? So in a number of poorer countries, for example, they figured out how to keep people within the communities they came from and not migrate to the capital, because the opportunities in the capital are so much better. And for example, in Zambia, what they did with really smart individuals, they wanted to stay in the community and help with healthcare, is they gave them the opportunity, if they ever wanted, to join a service at the center. But they said, this is your lifeline. If you find the community terrible and you simply cannot bear it any longer, you can exercise this lifeline. You can leave the community and come to the center. But till that time, please stay in your community, and we will pay you for staying there. And in fact, that worked. Good people stayed, they did very good work in the community, and a lot of infrastructure built around them. So we have to think of clever ways the community can retain its best and brightest. And there may be a central role there. For example, in the US, a lot of people leave declining communities for college. And college is, of course, expensive. So one way to get them to go back is to offer to pay their college debt if they go back and stay in the community for a substantial period of time.
Indeed. So coming back also, it's another thing that is certainly possible to do. And also the fact that ideas can circulate, even if people leave, the ideas can still go back to their community. They can still think about their community. Often they do so.
Right.
So as we were talking about mobility, I think we need to talk about another issue that was highly debated at this festival, notably migration. Perhaps you can rephrase the 1992 slogan of the presidential election. It is migration stupid. I think we could say about explaining the success of especially right-wing parties and populist parties worldwide. They have been attacking non-governmental organizations. That's another dimension where there was this attempt to reduce the role of intermediate bodies. And yesterday, Filippo Grandi, the High Commissioner for the Refugees of the UN, has stressed very clearly the role that NGOs have been playing in reducing casualties associated to the refugee crisis, and the fact that the death toll associated to this, the percentage of flows that involves deaths has increased since they have been somewhat marginalized in the Mediterranean Sea. This is another example of how a representation of a political conflict that excludes what is in the middle is dangerous. So Kevin O'Rourke and Joël Mokyr, but also a young Italian researcher, Marco Tabellini, reminded us that this is not the first time that we experience large migration flows worldwide. At the beginning of the previous century, the US labor force had increased by some 25%, the Canadian, I think, by almost 50%, the Argentinian by some 80%, due to large migration flows. A problem associated to migration flows is also that it's difficult to, in a way, convince the native population, the population receiving these migrants, that you can keep on large social transfer, compensating possible losers in this process, because they don't want to transfer resources to people they believe are different from them, and they do fear that this transfer would be lost if this is. This is something that prevents to do some of the compensating policies that could be useful to address some of the concern of the population that have been suffering as a result of technological change and globalization. And in some countries, we have the impression that there is a vicious circle by now at work in which, politically driven campaign that exclude migrants from social transfer, do not invest in the integration of migrants, makes even more, in a way, less inclusive the communities, and they do not allow migrants to pay the social security contribution, to integrate, to do this type of thing, and that makes also the native population even more, in a way, less ready to receive these migrants. There is even more mistrust in the with respect to the newcomers. So what can we do in a way to improve the situation and to provide better, handle in a better way migration from a political economic standpoint? There are also here experiences in Chicago which could be somewhat interesting. The Moving to Opportunity program was a relocation. So having more migrants living in central areas of the towns where they are better accepted nowadays. We can also change rules for providing citizenship and allowing them to invest in integration. A use soli, perhaps a use soli combined with the fact that they should pay social security contribution and taxes in the country receiving them. Should we, I don't know, provide support at the central level for public good provisions at the local level in areas where there are many migrants? I think about schooling. Schooling is clearly more difficult when you have many migrants in. So I wonder what are your
No, I think you've hit on all the important issues. I mean, first, on whether migration is an economic problem. Beyond a certain level, below a certain level, it may be a solution. Beyond a certain level, it becomes a problem, right? And the question is, what is that level? Because we know that industrial countries are aging, so they need to accept a certain level of migration to keep the population relatively young, to keep the labor force relatively stable. We see the problem with a shrinking labor force already with Japan. And Japan today is considering whether to allow more migration because they find effectively they have an excess of capital, too little labor. And they're increasingly dependent on foreign demand because domestic demand is not working. So there is an optimal level of migration flows, an optimal quality of migrants. I don't think the argument that you accept only the best migrants necessarily works, because once you accept only above a certain quality, you find they get the best jobs, and that creates irritation also. So I think there is some need to think about who you accept and how much. But if you could control it, there is a certain level. The problem, of course, comes when you get substantially beyond that level, and there is a question of who pays the costs in absorption. And one of the problems, of course, is that migrants, being relatively poor, will go to poorer neighborhoods, where in fact they will overcrowd the existing social services that are there. The schools, as you said, will have a lot of migrant children who initially don't know the language and therefore hold back the classes. So it's not surprising that some people will feel the burdens of migration are borne increasingly by them, while they also face labor market competition. They face competition for jobs. You talked about the late 19th century. Interestingly, at that time in the United States, the native-born population found a way to compete with the migrants. The migrants that were coming from Europe were largely basically craftspeople. They knew how to do woodwork, they knew how to do carpentry, they knew how to do plumbing, but they were not very well educated. What the United States did was expanded high school education to all its children. And those children coming out of schools with high school education were far better suited for the kind of factory jobs that were opening up. So in effect, the native population was not as troubled by the migrants because they were taking different jobs. They were taking better jobs, while the migrants were substituting by providing their experience in jobs like carpentry, woodwork, and so on. And so that equilibrium was tolerable. Of course, today what we have is a concern. Again, at the lower end, it's not competition, because these migrants do a lot of jobs that the native population doesn't do. But I think the concern today more is with social services, as well as with the more amorphous sense of cultural domination, of being swamped culturally. What is my country going to be when my capital doesn't look like what I thought it looked 20 years ago? And that's a common feeling across much of Europe, some parts of the United States, but largely a European feeling because of the pace at which immigration has happened. One of the arguments I make in the book is, in the longer run, because richer societies have less children, if those societies, those countries are going to grow and maintain their pace in the world, they will become more varied. They will look different. How do you maintain a sense of cultural continuity? Well, at one level you can, because at the national level you can maintain a set of values which pertain to anybody who comes in. For example, this is our historical sense of who we are. Here are our broad sense of values. Here is the language that all of you should speak if we want to be part of this nation. Those are all reasonable. But then on specifics of the culture, it seems to me that the community can be a source of continuity rather than force it at the national level, force everybody to have the same sort of majority view. Instead, by having diverse communities, you can have the cultural continuity that you want. So to some extent, as our countries become more diverse, I think we will have to find ways to continue that culture, both the culture of the old native population, as well as the new cultures that come in. And there will be mixing at the edges, but you can also have cultural continuity through the community itself. And so, to my mind, we have to find a new kind of societal structure, especially as our countries become more diverse, because the alternative of imposing one common culture on everybody is going to be first more difficult, and second, there will be people who will refuse to be part of the culture, and you will have problems of cultural apartheid going on.
This is extremely important. This cultural proximity is very important, beyond the economic. That's why I think that use solely, like in Germany, could be a way to handle these issues. You have people born, say in Italy, they study Italian, they learn very well our language, they want to invest in our country, they want to become citizens. I wonder why we should force them to become heroes before we give them citizenship. And that may be fine. I had some discussion not only with people working in the Italian administration, but also people working at the European Commission for another choice that is often made. So they decide that refugees should be sent to rural areas. Where it's very difficult for them to integrate, to find, and also they are extremely visible because these are small towns, and if you send 10 people, they would immediately identify by the local population and perceive with some distrust. So I said, why don't you allow them to live in towns where there is a better labor market? And they said to me, because otherwise they would come. Too many of them would come. This is completely crazy in my view, because this is really a way to create, to make the problem even more difficult to handle.
Well, I think, as I said, too many becomes difficult, and we need to find a via media
Sure.
Of a way that there's a reasonable rate of absorption. But on this issue of sending people to the rural areas, what if those who wanted to apply on economic grounds for immigration, good doctors, good technocrats. A sort of requirement was you spend 4 years in this area which doesn't have a doctor or has very few doctors. The value of that is, of course, they provide local services. But another value is we talked about leadership, or we talked about human capital. They could replenish the human capital of their area. The children will go to schools, they will participate. But most important, they also give a sense that not all immigrants are sort of uneducated, trying to take your social security from you. They can also contribute. And so they may change the dialogue. As you know, one of the bigger concerns is the places that are most resistant to any immigration are the places which have the least encounter with immigrants, because they're rural areas, as you said, very few immigrants. They fear the possibility of immigrants rather than the actuality, right? And my sense is some spreading of the immigrant population may result in more learning from each other. In fact, surveys in the US show when you actually know an immigrant, your view of them is somewhat more receptive than the people who don't know any. And actual human contact makes a difference. And that more broadly is my point, that in the longer run, the future of the world is much more integration across countries in terms of trade, in terms of capital flows, in terms of people. And we have to prepare our societies for that world of tomorrow. Shock treatment by mixing immediately in big ways is not possible and creates a reaction. But can we at least mix at the edges a little more and give people confidence by saying there are vehicles, your own community, by which you can continue your culture, continue your history, continue your language. And in the longer run, at the edges, we'll mix more, and we will have a more varied but richer composite culture.
What you said about gradualism is indeed very, very important. Unfortunately, for refugee crisis, often this is not an option, because they come in large waves, unlike economic migrants. And the example of a doctor, I found it very nice, because could be a strategy actually to revitalize some internal rural areas in Italy as well. Because if you think about people working, clearly there you have very strong agglomeration economies. We have seen a lot of them, so you have a tendency to go to large conurbation and so on. But if you think about non-employment, and people, retirees, for instance, and Italy could attract retirees from all over the world. And but the problem is that we have to have medical services at the local level in rural areas. That's really a precondition to this to be done. Let's go to another set of issues that have been addressed by several lectures here. But it's a strange thing because the narrative of the populist and also this election is tend to underplay technological change and put at the forefront globalization, trade, and so on. And perhaps because it's easier to find enemies, these are external enemies rather than technological change. After all, is something that machines, and we have introduced machines ourselves. So Elfman, in particular, have been showing that technological change is way more important than globalization in having created a problem of restructuring, reallocation of jobs, destruction of jobs. And there was a very nice presentation by Rafael Di Tella. They made an experiment in which they look at the reaction of people depending on the nature of a shock. They show that if people, for instance, displaced workers, understand that the reason why their job has been lost is due to technological change, they are way more ready to accept compensation in the form of unemployment benefits, social assistance, and whatever, than if they know that the reason why their plant was shut down or their job was lost is due to the fact that there was a penetration of Chinese imports. So that reduced also the degree of acceptance of. This is really a problem of narrative and how to explain. How can we convince and explain that often it is technological change rather than import penetration? Moravchik, in another debate, has also been arguing that the type of trade protection that we are experiencing and that is more a bark type of attitude rather than a bite. So they're just threatening to do things, but at the end of the day, they won't do much. But we know also that protection is a very slippery slope, so we don't know where we end, and we don't know the reaction of the other countries, and we may end up in trade wars, as also was discussed somewhere. And another potential consequence of trade protection is that would increase migration. So we will go back to the problem that, and then it will be very large migration flows taking place. So what can we do in this respect? Is it simply a matter of telling the truth and explaining that it is more technological change? Should we try to give the response to technological change, perhaps rather than trade protectionism, allowing people to making the social welfare system more supportive of human capital investment, finding way to retrain people, so addressing the core issue imposed by technological change more than strictly by trade liberalization? Should we introduce at the level where trade policies are established also some unemployment benefits, for instance, having an unemployment benefits being run at the European level? I mean, what is in your view, the way to handle?
I think you defined populist earlier, and I would add one element to that, which is the populist also wants to propose easy solutions, solutions that blame others often. Not all populists, but some, that because it's easier to say the answer is I'm going to shut those people out, I'm going to change the rules so that now you will do okay. It's much harder to say the problem also lies with you, that your skills haven't adapted, partly because you never had to adapt, and that today you will have to make these hard choices. And governments haven't made it easy for workers to retrain, workers to reskill themselves. So when you say that coal mining is going to end, there is no future for it, you will have to find something new, it becomes something where the politician has no answer. On the other hand, if the politician says, I'm going to bring back coal mining by shutting out coal imports from everywhere else, and the coal mines will have a future again, the steel mills will have a future, even though people don't believe that he will have that level of protectionism, they know at least it's a policy that is something he can do, And it's something they would far prefer. They'd far prefer to get that old job back rather than to take a new job. It gives them some hope because for the new job, they need these skills which are really hard to get. I was shocked when I read this book, Janesville, which is about a GM plant closing down. And the author talks about GM workers who haven't used a computer. In this day and age, somebody who is 45, 50 years old has never used a computer. Now, for them to train is so difficult because they simply haven't kept up. Now, there are places which have insisted on continuous training and retraining. I mean, Scandinavia, Sweden, for example, active labor market policies. In the factories, the workers are told, you may lose your job. So therefore, think about alternatives. What are the courses you need to keep your skills up? So it's a coalition of the employer, the government, labor unions, and NGOs which come together and hire private sector consultants to keep looking at the skill base of the employees and how they can keep updating. So when the company closes down or fires a bunch of workers, those consultants come in and tell, okay, you can move to this industry, but you need this course and that course. That seems a far more streamlined way of dealing with it rather than, 30 years they've done nothing and you look at them and say, what can we make you fit for? It's much harder in that situation. So we do need to rethink the whole process of retraining, reskilling. When we unfortunately talk about protectionism, President Trump today said something like tariffs are easy. We haven't got the protections against protectionism so strongly built into our economies. Tariff seems to be the thing in many countries that the government has the easiest resort to. And when you can also tell a narrative around them that I'm protecting your jobs, it becomes politically very easy. So the mystery is how for 60 or 70 years post-World War II, we kept reducing tariffs and why we didn't have the burst of protectionism that we see today. Unfortunately, with the country at the center of the global order, now tearing up the global order and setting fire to it, we really are in a very dangerous situation. It doesn't start and begin with trade protectionism. What you will see very quickly is, or what we're already seeing is investment protectionism. I don't want these kinds of investments in my country, but I'm not going to let my companies invest in your country. And then all this global supply chains that we've built up, they're starting to break down. We are at the beginning of a very, very dangerous outcome for the global economy. It's particularly dangerous, I would argue, for industrial countries where populations are aging, where demand is increasingly going to be in the rest of the world. At this time, to adopt strongly protectionist measures is going to be really problematic going forward.
It's a very important point indeed. In fact, but for aging societies, this is even more a problem. And when you start a trade war, you never know where you end, and you have unfortunately historical precedents of. So we should rethink about welfare systems, make them more proactive and capable of finding remedies for permanent losers, people who have been displaced for a long time, rather than only temporary relief, perhaps.
No, for sure, and I think we need to pay far more attention to those left behind and figure out, the best outcome would be much better training systems such that they don't see a significant loss in income. The reality is for those who haven't kept up, this is going to be difficult. So the second best alternative is a lower level job plus supplementary income to make sure that they don't fall off too much. But my sense is, even if we can't solve the problem for the people of a certain age today, let's make sure the younger people today don't fall into the same trap. Let's find ways to continue regenerating human capital. And for that, we need to change our systems considerably from what they are today.
Right. And let's do the safety net, design them properly in order not to discourage people from looking for jobs. But there are a number of very specific design features that have been discussed at this festival, also concerning the reddito di cittadinanza, that I hope will be taken on board. But this leads me to the last set of issues that I would like to discuss with you, if possible, because many people have been addressing them at the festival. This morning, David Leiser have been suggesting that non-economists often use misleading cognitive shortcuts to form an opinion about economic issues, and often you have these wrong metaphors that are being used. We have some example of this in the recent debate, public debate in Italy about pensions. There was an idea of reintroducing an early retirement in Italy, and the way this was sold is this is going to create jobs for the young people. Depicting the labor market as a crowded bus, whereby if you want to get in, you need to have people leaving the bus, which is clearly a completely misleading metaphor, because labor market don't work that way. If you look at any series of employment and unemployment, you see that young and old people, when the jobs grow for the young and for the old people, grow for the natives and for the migrants. When they decline for both. There is nothing like a bus or a fixed number of jobs. Another metaphor, which is very popular, I know, because I keep on receiving letters of people saying the type of things, is that the pension system works as a bank deposit, so where you can withdraw the money whenever you like, rather than a pay-as-you-go system in which current workers pay. So, making people to understand how actually economics works, which is a rather complex body, is not an easy task. But sometimes the way people are stating things is so simple, and you have, given that there is a general mistrust these days against the expertise, is something that Mike Spence was saying very, very, very important things this afternoon together with Rob Johnson. So it's very difficult to cope with this simplification. So what should we do? Should we try and simplify ourselves with our language? To which extent? I mean, should we adopt the same metaphors that people accept, or should we resist that?
Well, it's hard, right? Because as the great French journalist in the 19th century, Bastiat, said, the reality about economics is not, the value of an economist is not about first-round effects or direct effects. That even the layman can see. It's about the second-round effects. What happens after the first round as people react? That's where the economist contributes. But that's much harder to see and much harder to explain. So take trade. Protectionism, in the same analogy as the bus, if I prevent that fellow from producing the good, my people can produce the good. So protectionism will create jobs. Now, as any economist will tell you, wait a minute. You are producing much more inefficiently in your country because that was the reason why you bought it from abroad. As you produce more inefficiently in your country, essentially the overall effect is in the long run going to be a loss to your country rather than a gain. And sometimes it shows up even in job losses in your country as you force, for example, you put tariffs on steel, you force your automakers to buy high-priced steel. Because they buy high-priced steel, they get competed out of the auto market. Because they're not producing as many cars, they have to fire some workers. So protecting the steel job comes at the expense of firing the auto worker. These are the kinds of relationships that economists will talk about, second-round effects and third-round effects, which are much harder to explain. Why, for example, does the central bank insist on raising interest rates? Or to bring down inflation. Well, why does inflation matter? Don't I care much more about jobs today than about inflation? Now, people in this room fully understand what the trade-offs are and why the trade-offs are made, but it's much harder to explain those, especially when you have a president saying the central bank is raising interest rates and preventing job growth, preventing my fine recovery. So when you're talking first, when you're having to defend as an expert against the politician, you're already at a disadvantage because the politician speaks the language of the people much more effectively than you as an expert. Second, you're trying to talk about nuances because the nuances are important. They ultimately subvert the first round effects the politician is talking about. But the politician will say, this is the effect, And this guy next to me talking about all this doesn't know anything. He sits in an academic room in an ivory tower and writes his papers that nobody reads. But I know the real world, I experience it every day, and here's what it's like. As the public, who are you going to believe? So, in some sense, when it comes to a fight between the expert and the politician, in the short run, there is no contest. The politician will always win. The hope is that the expert over time, through evidence, through examples, through books, through discussions like this, builds trust. And that's why I think the point that Mike Spence was making is so important, that trust in experts is critical, because they can talk whatever they want. So long as you trust that they're doing the right thing by you, you allow them the ability to make policy. And I think that was there in Europe for 30, 40 years after World War II. That resulted in substantial growth. When that trust breaks down, when the expert has to justify every last policy, on the one hand, it's good, it puts some check and balance on the expert, but it makes policy making much harder.
That's a very important point. And also, I think it's important to democratize the debate and allow people to know that the discussion is there are issues that are complicated and that there are also different opinions in our profession. Sometimes you may think, as also Mike Spence was saying this afternoon, when you present two economists having two different views, sometimes they have even 3 or 4 different views, may weaken to some extent, the way experts are being perceived. But I think it's important also to show that it's so complicated issues that often you may not have exactly the same view on that type of things. I think this is perhaps what we try and do in Trento to some extent, and to allow people to come and discuss and be exposed. And in all of the meetings I was at, the audience asked very relevant questions, and it was an exercise for people being at the top of research to cope with issues, and without, however, ever giving up the idea that you need to go in the detail and explain things.
But Tito, on this point of 4 economists having 5 views or 6 views, I think the reality is that there is a fair amount of consensus in the economic profession on many things, but it's always possible to find some outliers. And one of the realities about policy making that people will tell you is it doesn't matter what the profession thinks. What the politician is looking for is somebody who thinks like him. Who is the guy who's writing stuff that mirrors my view on how the world should be run? And that's the economist who's trotted out and gets the stage at that point. So there is a little bit of gamesmanship here to make the economist profession sometimes. We have a lot of debates, but they're often about second-order effects. We agree on the first-order effects and some of the second-order effects also.
Indeed. So perhaps we can take 1 or 2 questions, and then we talk about let's see if there is anybody here. There. So I think it's Joel. Now wait a second. There is the microphone coming, so everybody can. No, qui. Everybody can hear you.
Let me be provocative just to get your juices flowing, right?
Thanks,
So
Joel.
you talked about space-based action. And I would say as an economist, I don't give a damn about space. Trees and hills and valleys don't appear in my social welfare function. People do. And once you realize that, your arguments about migration seem to me a bit more questionable. I mean, most of the migration that we have seen in the last 200 years to the New World, I would say without any question, economic historians agree, have been welfare improving. Now, that doesn't mean that was good for the people who stayed behind. And so we have to weigh their losses against the gains of the people who moved and the gains of the people who were already there, who received ready-made human capital, adults, and so on and so forth. But my sense is that anything that's space-based in and of itself seems to be off base, Raghu. I mean, I don't care about space.
Yeah. Great point, Joel. And here is an example of two economists disagreeing. uh, See, I think it goes back to what assumptions we have, right? When I say place-based or space-based measures, I'm talking about populations that have very low mobility. And as you know, the increasing concern in the United States is about mobility not being as high as we thought it was. And if in fact there are populations that are locked in there, if they weren't, I don't care. San Francisco is doing very well creating jobs, let people move to San Francisco. It's if they can't all move to San Francisco because there are prohibitive rents out there, there's a prohibitive cost of living, that you require on minimum a certain level of capability to be there, then I really want to take the capability building to where they are, rather than tell them all to move to San Francisco. Similarly, to the extent that there is a community out there and jobs have disappeared, and not all people, in fact, the research that Otora and all suggest is people stay where they are instead of moving to where the jobs are, and the people who stay are the lower income people and so on. If that is the case, I may have to target more place-based measures to get them up and running, rather than say they will decline. Now, there are some communities which you can't do anything about, and you have to say, well, I would give them a ticket to leave rather than stay. And you have to close down some communities. But there are many that are on the threshold. If they deteriorate more, they will become the kind that you will have to give a ticket and be part of that. But many can revive. And for them, some place-based measures can be very helpful.
Another question from the floor. Here. Qui, signore qua, si alza in piedi adesso.
Hello, my name is Tobias Pieler, I'm a German journalist. Can you try to apply the last point also to Europe? Because Europe is not as homogeneous as the United States. So when you have a problem in Greece, you can't tell them all to move to London. Or you can't tell people from Portugal to move to Spain, because there is also a language barrier, a cultural barrier, and so on. What does this give you as a consequence for the European common market with the right to move to any other country, but maybe in practice it's different?
Well, I think it goes back to the earlier point that, in a sense, we don't want Greece to depopulate and move entirely elsewhere. So certainly there is an issue of regional development. And the EU obviously has regional development funds, which are relatively small, but certainly it exists. But my point has been that the problem of development can't really be solved from the outside. It can be supported from the outside, but it often is solved from the inside. And you need to find people there who are willing to take charge, who are willing to move forward, who are willing to revive. And each country, each region, if it's lucky, finds those people. And that's when it grows. But there are also a lot of underdeveloped countries and underdeveloped regions that have not shown any progress for a long period of time. We can try ways of seeding that process, but ultimately we have to recognize, and this is unfortunately the sorry history of development of countries, it cannot be done from the outside.
There is the empowerment we were also talking about.
Empowerment, enrichment through seeding of the population, getting people to stay and come back. Those are things that can energize the movement. Sharing best practices. One of the things the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia does in its community development is get communities together to explain what they've done and how they've done things differently. All that is possible. But I think ultimately to think that we will do it through a central process is probably overestimating the capacity of the center. It doesn't happen that way. You can pour a lot of money, but it doesn't work. I mean, think about the amount of money that's gone into Nigeria in trying to develop it.
Well, Raghu, thank you so much. As I said before, we hope to have you back very soon to the festival. And we are sure that this book will be as influential as the previous one, and your talk has been extremely enlightening for us. So I switch back, torno all'italiano, semplicemente per presentarvi alcuni dati su questa edizione del festival, il cui bilancio chiaramente potrà essere tratto soltanto nei prossimi giorni. Abbiamo avuto 204 relatori, abbiamo avuto 114 eventi, 105 dirette web, 5 milioni e 100.000 connessioni, quindi un incremento importante rispetto all'anno scorso in cui erano state circa 4 milioni. Abbiamo avuto 52.000 connessioni alle dirette streaming, anche qui un incremento, erano 40.000 l'anno scorso, 333 addirittura il numero esatto, giornalisti, operatori e fotografi, 154 testate giornalistiche, molte straniere, e devo dire c'è Project Syndicate, che è un'associazione, un network di giornali che poi diffonde anche questi analisi, articoli in tutto il mondo, che ha dato un grandissimo spazio al Festival dell'Economia, quindi ci aspettiamo che alcuni delle presentazioni al Festival verranno poi riprese da giornali in tutto il mondo. E poi una partecipazione importante della città di Trento, mi sembra importante sottolinearlo, 120 gli esercizi pubblici che hanno richiesto materiale del festival a Trento, e ancora una volta un successo del concorso che noi abbiamo fatto nelle scuole secondarie, 134 le scuole superiori che hanno aderito. Hanno partecipato tanti studenti, più di 1000 studenti, e di questi ne sono stati selezionati 20, quindi la selezione è stata davvero feroce, noi li abbiamo premiati in questa edizione del festival. Vorrei qui adesso chiamare il presidente della provincia Fugatti, Paolo Collini, rettore dell'università, Innocenzo Cipolletta, Giuseppe Laterza, Andrea Fracasso. Vorrei chiamare anche però Marilena De Francesco, che spero venga con noi, che è stata così importante nel seguire il lavoro di questa amministrazione, e l'assessore Brugnaro, che anche rappresenta il municipio di Trento, la città di Trento.
Prima di chiedere al Presidente della Provincia di Trento, Maurizio Fugatti, di concludere come tradizione, volevamo farvi vedere una piccola testimonianza. Stamattina, andando a fare una passeggiata molto presto la mattina, come mi succede svegliando, mi sono fermato a un piccolo chiosco che molti di voi trentini conoscono, vicino alla stazione. Ho incontrato una signora Flora, fantastica, che aveva un grembiule del festival. Allora le ho chiesto perché signora porta questo grembiule, ed ecco quello che mi ha risposto. Ma perché mette il grembiule del Festival dell'Economia?
Perché io ci tengo l'economia, e l'economia parte dal piccolo imprenditore. Siamo noi che siamo qui 15 ore al giorno e creiamo una piccola ricchezza, e assolutamente non evadiamo tasse.
Ho capito. È per questo che mette il grembiule del Festival dell'Economia?
No, lo metto per far capire alle persone che l'economia è interessante, è importante nella vita l'economia.
Ok.
Ciao tesoro, parte da lì.
Quindi è contento del Festival dell'Economia?
Certo che sono contenta, è 15 anni che sono qua. E io sono chiusa la domenica, da notare. Apro solo perché c'è la festa dell'economia. Per 15 anni io sono qua. E ci alziamo, apriamo alle 5, ci alziamo alle 4, siamo qui fino alle 8 la sera. Questa è economia, lavorare. Oh, vieni tesoro.
Buongiorno a tutti. Beh, credo che questo sia stato l'esempio un po' di come il popolo, perché chi conosce quel luogo dove è stato girato il il video è un piccolo bar fuori dalla stazione dove la partecipazione è proprio, diciamo, popolare, di come anche il popolo apprezzi questo Festival dell'economia, che a volte magari parla di tematiche anche che sembrano difficili da capire, perché insomma, perché non è che sia tematiche sempre all'ordine del giorno da parte dell'opinione pubblica, però alla fine Trento, la città, il Trentino, riconosce l'importanza di questo festival e riconosce l'importanza anche per la comunità stessa trentina, oltre che per l'immagine nazionale e internazionale delle tematiche che vengono toccate, con al centro Trento e il Trentino. Io credo che questo sia un motivo di orgoglio per la nostra comunità. Devo fare i complimenti agli organizzatori, perché quest'anno sicuramente è stato colto il tema, anche, cioè, pensarlo un anno fa, a una settimana dalle elezioni europee, e indovinare questo titolo, diciamo che non sarà facile riuscire a indovinare un'altra volta da qui a un anno, 2 anni o 3 anni, questo credo sia oggettivo, però diciamo che è stato colto sicuramente nelle sua essenzialità economica e politica, anche perché ovviamente al festival, parlando di tematiche come queste, si fa anche scevro da inclinazioni di parte, si fa anche si toccano anche tematiche politiche. Ecco, noi crediamo che questa rassegna anche quest'anno abbia dimostrato, abbiamo sentito i numeri ancora più importanti di quelli degli anni scorsi, abbia dimostrato come questo festival sia importante e debba continuare ad aumentare il dibattito su se stesso, il più possibile sempre in un ambito di pluralismo, sentendo tutte le diverse sensibilità che ci possono essere su tematiche così importanti e così difficili anche da sciogliere e da capire. Quindi da parte nostra il ringraziamento a tutti coloro che hanno lavorato, al comitato scientifico, agli uffici stampa, ai giornalisti, anche di quelli della nostri uffici provinciali, perché crediamo che in questi 3 giorni Trento sia stata ancora una volta al centro del dibattito economico, finanziario, internazionale, e Trento di questo deve essere orgogliosa, al di là che magari certe volte possono piacere certe tematiche o non possono piacere certe tematiche. Quindi grazie per il lavoro e al festival dell'anno prossimo.
Basta. Sì, sì, sì. Basta, è più che sufficiente.